Hey y'all, just a quick note before we get started today. This episode includes discussion of sexual abuse. Please keep that in mind when choosing when and where to listen. And if you or someone you know may be a victim of sexual abuse, confidential support, information, and advice are available at the National Sexual Assault Hotline by calling 800-656-4673. In November of last year, protests erupted in the small Oregon city of St. Helens. Students and parents called for more accountability after 2 teachers were arrested for allegedly abusing students.
Fire them! Fire Dr. Wagner! Fire her!
A police investigation led to the arrests of choir teacher Eric Stearns and recently retired math teacher Mark Collins, who were charged with sexually abusing multiple students between 2015 and 2024. St. Helens High School junior Peyton Malden laid out the students' concerns.
We've been here the last 2 days protesting. We believe that our superintendent should be fired or resign along with our high school principal and our school district board. They have allowed reports to be made and done nothing about it, and we believe that they should take the reports seriously and that they should keep us safe and protect us.
Within a few weeks, the school board placed the superintendent and the principal on paid administrative leave. The superintendent eventually resigned. The principal, Katie Wagner, was arrested and charged with 2 felony counts of criminal mistreatment. Students and community members continued to speak out publicly about a culture where reports of abuse were repeatedly ignored by people in power. Janae Brinster was part of the protests in November.
I was an alumni. I graduated in 2003, and now my own children are going here. I've watched this for the last however many years, and I seen it when I was a teenager here, and it's got to stop.
From the Grote Boyle studio, I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB about the place you call home. This is not the first time that a teacher at St. Helens High School has been accused of abusing students. In 2019, a former teacher there named Kyle Wrobleski was sentenced to more than 4 years in prison for grooming and sexually abusing a 17-year-old student. OPB reporter Joni Audenland covered the upheaval in St. Helens as it unfolded late last year. Around that same time, they got an email from someone who graduated from high school there in 1988. She told Joni that, in her words, quote, "The abuse in this school and lack of care by the community has been going on much longer than the 2000s. That email launched a months-long investigation by OPB. I'm going to toss it to Joni now to give you the details.
The person who emailed me was Jody Westing. She said she had read my recent stories about allegations of abuse by teachers at St. Helens High School, and that it brought up some difficult memories for her. She went on to say that when she was a 17-year-old senior at St. Helens High School, a 31-year-old teacher groomed and manipulated her into a sexual relationship with him. She also said that people in positions of power in the school district knew about the alleged abuse and did nothing. I emailed her back and asked if she'd be open to an interview. A few days later, I visited her at her home.
I'm Jody Westing, formerly Jody Goff. I've lived in Oregon since 1977 or something like that. And I grew up in a small town called St. Helens on the Columbia River, about 30 miles out of Portland. Paper mill town, very blue collar, maybe 7,000 people. And we moved there when I was in 3rd grade.
Jody revealed the name of the person she says abused her, Gene Evans. It was a name that was familiar to some of my OPB colleagues. For years, he was a spokesperson for the Oregon Department of Human Services. Jody told me she learned about his position when she heard him on OPB more than a decade ago.
I was sitting in my home office doing work on the computer, and I heard his voice on the radio being interviewed, and I just kind of froze up. It all came back. and they were saying, well, this is Gene Evans and the spokesperson for the DHS, Oregon, and I just about lost my mind. I'm like, are you kidding me?
Evans also worked as a spokesperson for the Oregon Department of Education. Here was someone who had been the public face of 2 state agencies responsible for the welfare of children. I wanted to understand more about Jody's story and what she remembered about her time at St. Helens High School, and what it could tell us about the current abuse scandal. I asked her what she was like in high school.
I ran track, played basketball, got, on the honor roll, straight A's, all that kind of good stuff. I was involved. I was a good student. I was an athlete. I think I cried once when I got a B. I was a pleaser, very much a pleaser.
I also asked Jody what she remembered about Gene Evans from that time.
There was the cool teacher, Mr. Evans. He taught economics and photography and maybe personal finance. And I just remember everybody thought he was super cool. I had him as a teacher my beginning part of senior year, and just like one of the kids, one of the cool guys.
Evans was in his 4th year at St. Helens High School in 1987 and was popular among the student body. He was also married and had an infant son. Jody said Evans pursued her in much the same way one of her classmates might have, leaving little notes on her desk and making her mixtapes. After a couple months, she says that progressed to spending time alone with him outside of school.
I remember taking a ride with him in his car. He had a Isuzu Trooper. And we just kind of went through town, and I remember he reached over and held my hand. And of course, no one could see because we were in the car. I think we went to Burgerville or something exciting. And that was kind of one of the first things I remember off campus. I remember he'd buy me little gifts, like little necklace and earrings. And So I think he gave me, I remember a Christmas present, and I remember going to his house. I don't know if they were separated at that time, but I remember going to his house once.
Jody said that she told 3 of her closest friends about all of this at the time.
And they were all kind of friends with him too, so it was like he was part of the friend group, I guess.
I spoke to all 3 of the people that Jody says she told. Janelle Kittleson was Jody's best friend in high school, and she also had Evans as a teacher. Janelle shared some diary entries with me from that time, in which she wrote about the relationship between Jody and Gene Evans. In one entry, she said, quote, "Society would really look down on it because she's 17 and he's 31, and not to mention he's a teacher who is now going to divorce his wife." Janelle said that early on, Evans tried to get information from her about her friend Jody.
Well, I remember him calling me on the phone, and I thought, why is he calling me at home? And my parents said, your teacher's on the phone. And I remember he was asking, just kind of, back then I thought it was just being curious about my friends. Like, oh, he's talking to me about my friends. And, but it was asking about Jody, asking about the music she liked, what she liked to do, was she as cool as she seemed? From that kid perspective, I thought, oh, he just wants to know about how cool we are.
Jody told me that for spring break, she convinced her parents to let her go with Janelle and some other friends to the Oregon coast. What she didn't tell them is that, according to her and her friend Janelle, her teacher, Mr. Evans, would also be there.
And I think that was the first time I remember being physically involved with him. Maybe there had been like a kiss or something before, but that was the first time.
Jody says she was 17 when she and Evans had sex for the first time. At the time, Oregon law said that anyone under the age of 18 is incapable of consenting to a sexual act. She also told me that on that same trip, while she and Evans were walking on the beach holding hands, they ran into another teacher.
Mr. Tinkle, Jerry Tinkle. He had been my coach for years. And he's standing there and he kind of looks and we immediately drop hands and kind of ran into him and started talking. And he just kind of Jerry Tinkle looked really confused and was kind of like, okay, well, good to see you. And he was there with his family. But then I later found out that he went into the principal like the next day back at school and told him, like, this is what I saw, reported it.
Janelle Kittleson also remembered running into Jerry Tinkle and how awkward it got when he saw Jody and Jean together.
I remember being like, my heart racing, like, oh crap, this isn't good. This is obviously not good because he's married. That was my only thinking. He's married. And so my friend is with a married person, not that he's with a bunch of minors from school.
That was the scandal back then, was he was married, not that he was holding hands with a minor.
I mean, and it was also that he was the teacher, but in my mind, I was thinking, oh, if this gets out, this is really bad for Jean, and Jody is going to be, labeled the bad girl, and she's such a good girl. But I knew that it wasn't appropriate.
I spoke to Jerry Tinkle, and I asked him about his former colleague, Gene Evans. He said that he remembered seeing him and Jody on the beach, and that he later reported what he saw to the principal at the time. According to him, that's the last he heard of it from the administration. I could not find any documentation of Tinkle's report to the principal. I got Evans's personnel file through a public records request, and there was no mention of any complaints or reports against him. And as far as I can tell, if Tinkle did report something, there was no follow-up. Gene Evans did resign at the end of that school year in 1988. In his resignation letter, he says he plans on, quote, moving to Eugene to pursue other career interests. Jody planned on attending the University of Oregon in Eugene that fall. I spoke to a lot of other people in the course of this investigation, including friends and family members of Jody's and other students who attended St. Helens High School at the same time she did. Some said Jody's case was not an isolated one. Another student told me that in a previous school year, she had been groomed by Gene Evans and that he forced her to grope him multiple times in the school darkroom. 2 other former students said Evans inappropriately touched them during class. Evans was never charged with any crime from his time as a teacher. I wanted to get his response to all of this, to include his perspective in the story. I couldn't reach him by phone or email, so I visited his home in Lake Oswego. My colleague Lauren Dake came with me.
Hi, Gene?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Joni. This is Lauren. We're with OPB. We're doing a story about St. Helens School District and some historical abuse there, and we wanted to ask you about your relationship with Jody Goff.
No, thanks.
Can I give this letter at least with our questions?
We're leaving a letter for you.
After that, I reached out to Evans by phone again and sent him a certified letter. The same letter we left at his house that day, detailing the allegations against him and asking for a response. I did not receive one by the deadline stated in the letter. After the original story published on the OPB website, Evans emailed me this statement, right here by my colleague, Dave Miller.
These are stories and allegations from nearly 40 years ago. I have never been questioned, investigated, or charged with any wrongdoing like this during my years as a teacher or any time since.
Jody says that around the time she graduated high school, she told Evans that they couldn't keep the relationship a secret anymore. And that's when they told her parents.
So he came in to my house, met my parents, and kind of basically said, from what I remember, he said, I was there, but he said something like, she's very special and I want to be able to have an input in helping to form her or mold her or, help her achieve where she should go in life. And I think my parents were just sitting there like, what the heck? And my dad is a pretty redneck kind of guy, and I can see his fists clenching. And then my mom, I guess later met with Gene individually. They went to the high school track or something and were talking, and she was just kind of like, what the hell, And he told her, well, if you make her choose, she's going to choose me, and you might not have a relationship with her anymore.
Gene said that to your parents?
To my mom, yeah. And I didn't know that until much, 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 much later.
She was still 17 at that point, below the legal age of consent. She turned 18 in August of 1988. Evans was 31. And according to Jody and family members, he kind of became part of the family and would attend family events and dinners. They treated it kind of like a normal relationship. I spoke to Jody's mom, Sandy Heath, and asked how all of this happened. She described that one-on-one conversation she had with Evans.
He said that, if you guys make a big deal about this, she'll probably run away. So, and I believed him. I shouldn't have, but I did, in retrospect. So, we really didn't do anything.
Sandy also said that now she regrets the choices she made when Jody told her she was in a relationship with her teacher.
I didn't even think about her being a victim, to be honest. Sad to say. But she was. She's only 17. I don't think we considered the fact that, it was such a horrible situation for her to be in.
Jody told me that she kind of felt like, at the time, because her parents didn't push back or try to prevent the relationship, that it must be okay. But she also has a lot of empathy for her parents.
Something to know about is my parents were very young when they had me. So they were like 18 when I was born. So they were young parents all along with me. And I think there's a lot of regret that they didn't do anything, but they didn't know what to do.
And she has a different perspective now as a parent herself.
Well, having a daughter who's 20 and who's in college right now, just like loss and grief and regret that I didn't have those experiences. I didn't have the friends. I didn't have just that whole piece. The whole time in my life was just so weird and secret, and it kind of became this scar tissue, and it was just all about him.
We know for a fact that Gene Evans resigned from his position in the summer of 1988. We also know that he and his wife got divorced that same year. We know Jody Westing attended the University of Oregon in Eugene that fall, and that Evans moved there too. She says that she and Evans continued their relationship while she was in college, and even lived together in an apartment at one point. I spoke with several people, her friends and family, and another former St. Helens teacher, who all confirmed that's what happened. The teacher, Patrick Brame, said it was a crushing blow to hear that his colleague was in a relationship with a former student. Jody said her first 2 years in college were really shaped by her relationship with Evans. According to Jody and her friends at the time, she really felt isolated, like she was keeping a nasty secret. That's what eventually led her to break up with him.
In the little apartment complex where we were living, there were 2 other apartments. Each of them had 2 girls, and I kind of, I would see them walk by every day, and we would be friendly and say hello. And I just remember talking to them one time, and they said, "Oh yeah, next year we're all renting this big house." And I just thought, that's what I want. I want that. And so I remember telling them, "I'll live with you. Do you have enough space? I'd love to live there." And so I think that was kind of what did it for me, was just that separation between seeing what I was doing and what my life was, and just kind of, it was all about him in this just really small little box where we lived. And then just seeing all around me these other people living the way I felt like this is what I should be doing. I need to be a kid.
Jody has done a lot of therapy in the years since, but it was hearing Gene Evans' voice on the radio that prompted her to confront her feelings. Over the years, she's come to realize that she was, as she puts it, manipulated. She says it never would have happened otherwise.
This shouldn't have been my story. I should have just been a normal kid doing normal things with their normal friend, whatever normal looked like, but not this. This wasn't what I should have experienced.
Coming up after a break, we'll find out what's happened since this story came out and learn more about the reporting process. So, Joni, what has happened since you broke this story earlier this year?
Well, the Oregon Department of Human Services did open an investigation into the allegations that Gene Evans abused Jody and other students when he was a teacher at St. Helens High School. If the state investigators determined abuse did occur, then Evans would have a chance to appeal those findings. And while DHS investigations don't carry any legal authority or weight, if abuse is determined founded, then he would have a sex abuse finding in DHS records. And that would show up in a background check if he was applying for a job to work with children, stuff like that. It's worth mentioning, too, that Evans still receives about $40,000 a year from his state pension from his time as a spokesperson, and that's unlikely to change.
This is such a multifaceted story with so much detailed reporting on such a heavy topic. Joni, how did you approach interviewing people about something so sensitive?
It was really tricky at times. I had to walk this line of getting information from people while at the same time not making them feel like they're being interrogated. So I usually went in with a little spiel that I would give at the start of each interview. I'd say something like, I want you to tell me your whole story from beginning to end, and I'll let you know what questions I have afterwards. Jen, this was so long ago. Most people just needed a few minutes to remember what actually happened.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and letting them know that I'm going to ask some graphic, hard questions, but those details are absolutely vital for telling their stories. People need to know exactly what happened. Mm-hmm. I also had a lot of emotional conversations with people in between the time that I initially interviewed them and when the story actually came out. We had to do a lot of reporting and requests for documents, and our legal team had to look over everything. And it was hard for Jody and the other people I spoke with to wait while that was going on. Yeah, as a reporter, you feel a great deal of responsibility for their emotions. Mm-hmm. You've asked these people to bare their souls to you. And so you don't just get to be radio silent after the first interview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely understand not wanting to leave people waiting too long, especially when the topic is so sensitive. Mm-hmm. So how did they react when the story was finally published?
They said it was very cathartic for them. Some of them had not told anyone about their experience. So that's 30 plus years of holding that in. There's also an accountability factor. Not only is Gene Evans' name out there, but it's also acknowledging the school district likely failed to intervene.
Yeah. And Joni, how did covering this story affect the way you thought about the current scandal involving more recent allegations of abuse by teachers at St. Helens that OPB had been covering previously?
Yeah, when I went to that first protest at St. Helens High School, I remember wondering why the protests were so large. You don't always see these kinds of big demonstrations when a teacher is accused of abuse. So why the big reaction in this case? And in a way, this story kind of helped connect those dots. One thing we've uncovered is that there have been multiple teachers arrested for abuse at St. Helens High School over the years. And there's frustration in St. Helens that this keeps happening and that school officials have not taken the problem seriously enough. And there's a feeling that when it comes to St. Helens, abuse in schools is really a generational problem.
Yeah, and I just think of even the generational trauma that something like this can cause people if it goes on unchecked for so long.
I think you heard that in the quotes at the beginning of the episode, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Joni, I'm curious about what this reporting process was like for you. I mean, first of all, had you done an investigation like this before? And what did you learn from it?
I had never done an investigation on this scale before. And I was lucky to work with other journalists here at OPB who helped me along the way. My editor, Anna Griffin, and fellow reporter, Lauren Dake, who really helped guide me through our story. Mm-hmm. Our digital editor, Meekin Cuthill, also really helped make the story what it is. And our attorney, Rebecca Moores, who went over everything in great, meticulous detail. And it really taught me how to conduct interviews in a better, more compassionate way, as I was saying earlier. Also, how to see an investigation through to the end. There's so much that can kill a story like this, and you need to have a lot of perseverance and, frankly, help from others to see a story through to the end, and I was lucky to have that for sure.
Well, I'm glad for you and our whole audience that perseverance and support led to such great reporting. If you could go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice on how to approach this story, what would it be?
A couple things. Have patience, for one. Like I said, the story took months to report and fact check and write. And similarly, to take care of yourself. These are very hard stories for people to share. A lot of trauma rises to the surface. And as a journalist, constantly talking to people about the worst days of their lives can take a toll. I think by the time we published, I was having nightmares about Gene and Jody on a nearly nightly basis. And I wish I'd been more proactive about addressing that because that sort of wears you down by the end, I think.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, I'm sorry you went through that, but that's really good advice to yourself. And I just so appreciate all your work on this. Thank you so much for sharing your reporting and giving us some insight into your process.
You're welcome.
Joni Auden-Land is a general assignment reporter for OPB. You can read their full coverage of the investigation into Gene Evans and the more recent arrests at St. Helens High School at opb.org. And again, if you or someone you know may be a victim of sexual abuse, confidential support, information, and advice are available at the National Sexual Assault Hotline by calling 800-656-4673. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. Julie Sabatier produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. Nalene Silva engineered the episode. The OPB podcast team also includes Mia Estrada and Sage Fan Wing. Joni Auden-Land did the interviews you heard. Our theme music comes from Audio Network. And if you have a question for us, please reach out. Email theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.